Hello, and welcome to the Identity Paradox Inside the Racial Pharmacon, a podcast examining anti-racist theories and practices aimed at dismantling destructive identitarian politics and ideologies, both in the US and abroad. Please note that discussions deal with very difficult subject matter, so every episode comes with a general content warning.
And I'm your host, Carlos Gallego, Associate Professor of English, as well as both Distinguished Teaching Professor in the Humanities here at St. Olaf College. This podcast is part of the programming brought to you by the Bolt Chair Endowment, so special thanks to the Bolt family for making this programming possible. If you enjoyed today's podcast, make sure to subscribe for future episodes. And now, the show.
Hello and welcome from downtown Minneapolis. This is the Identity Paradox. I'm your host, Carlos Gallego. And before I introduce today's special guest, I just wanted to make a quick announcement about the podcast. I apologize for not releasing an episode in September, but I've come to realize that the beginning of the school year during the pandemic can be extremely confusing, chaotic, and busy. And I've also learned that producing a 1-hour podcast requires a lot more time than I anticipated. So we're going to probably move to a one episode per month schedule. And we'll try our best to drop 2 episodes whenever possible, but I think it's more realistic to just go with the 1 episode. But I'm very, very confident that today's special guest will more than make up for the absence of a September episode. And today's special guest, very special guest, is David Neiwert. He's a journalist, author, and acknowledged expert in American right-wing extremism. He's appeared on Anderson Cooper 360, CNN Newsroom, and The Rachel Maddow Show. His work has also appeared in the American Prospect, The Washington Post, MSNBC, Salon, as well as other publications. He's a veteran reporter and editor. He served as the correspondent for the Southern Poverty Law Center's Hate Watch blog and is currently a staff writer for the Daily Kos. He received the National Press Club Award for Distinguished Online Journalism in 2000 for a domestic terrorism series he produced for MSNBC.com. His previous books include, and here I'll just put up numbers because there are so many books, and I'm not even including all of them. Is that David or Dave? Either one?
What's that?
Either one, Dave or David?
Either one's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we'll go with Dave for right now.
Yeah, it's conversational.
Conversational, thank you.
Yeah.
His previous books include In God's Country, The Patriot Movement and the Pacific Northwest, Death on the 4th of July, The Story of a Killing, a Trial, and Hate Crime in America, Of Orcas and Men, What Killer Whales Can Teach Us, which I find very interesting. It's kind of like, okay, where does this fit in? I thought that you probably, considering your interest, would have written about great white sharks, but I guess not.
I prefer cool animals.
Yeah, and I've seen videos of killer whales taking down great white sharks like they're, just fun, like a big seal, basically. So that's a whole other conversation, I think, for another podcast.
Yeah, there's a story there.
There's definitely a story, if not multiple stories. The Eliminationists, how, I don't even know what number I'm on. The Eliminationists, how hate talk radicalized the American right. Strawberry Days, how internment destroyed a Japanese American community. Alt-America, the rise of the radical right in the age of Trump, as well as And Hell Followed With Her, Crossing the Dark Side of the American Border, which won the 2014 International Latino Book Award, which I'm incredibly embarrassed and ashamed to say that I did not know that and was unaware of that. And I feel like that's yet another reason to take away my PhD for unworthiness. His most recent publication, Red Pill, Blue Pill, How to Counteract the Conspiracy Theories That Are Killing Us, examines the widespread damage caused by authoritarian extremism, including how radicalization and conspiracy theories may be opposed on the individual level. Dave, it's an honor and privilege to have you on the show today. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Yeah, life is good.
Staying busy?
Yes. Yeah. The last 4 years have been actually hellishly busy for me.
I wonder why that'd be the case, especially for someone with your specialization. And I also noticed you almost published something for the Daily Kos almost every day this week. I went back and looked at it.
Yeah, I tried to write a daily post. Yeah.
You're incredibly prolific. Let me just put it that way. So I want to start with my first question by kind of taking a big picture view of your career in general, and looking at your career as a journalist, as an author, and what I would call an overall public intellectual. It seems that the trajectory of your work has gone from investigative research, where you kind of expose the existence or the presence of these extremist groups and cultures throughout the United States, towards more of a theorizing of why this is happening and what the kind of social and psychological reasons or motivations or factors for this new kind of phenomena that's emerging is taking place. And it kind of culminates, at least in my view, it culminates with your most recent publication, a red pill, blue pill. Would you say that's a fair assessment of your career at this point, or?
Yeah, I would say that that's what I've had been doing. I mean, even with my first book, In God's Country, which I published in '99, I think when you report on right-wing extremism and you actually are seeing it in action, as you see how it affects people's lives and how it affects communities and how it affects the fabric of society generally, you can't help but start, you're part of, I think, what a responsible reporter should do is, discuss this and discuss how it's happening and why it's happening, and discuss a mechanism by which people can become radicalized, because we've seen so many lies. I mean, the reason that I settled on this back in the '90s as a topic to focus my work on is that right-wing extremism, in all the years that I've been covering it, and that goes back to the late '70s and early '80s, just leaves a trail of human wreckage and its waste. And so part of it, when I started writing about it, was that I thought, well, what's going to be a subject that's going to constantly be constantly producing stories for me to write about? And it was very obvious from my experience that I should look at right-wing extremism, because it was just story after story, particularly up here in the Pacific Northwest, with in the Aryan Nations organization and their activities in the '80s, as well as what was continuing on with the militia movements in the '90s, that these movements were going to continue to have this toxic effect. They were going to continue to destroy personal relationships, families, and communities in the way that I've seen them do. And so I think it's really important to try to, if you're going to report on that, I think you need to really start thinking about the dynamics of it and explaining to people how and why this is happening. And so, by the time I was writing about it in 2008 or 9, a lot of the activity that I was reporting on then was more occurring really in the media, as well as on the ground, in terms of, say, the formation of the Tea Party and that sort of activism. And I was going out and covering Tea Party events and that sort of thing, but a lot of my time was actually being spent monitoring media, and particularly Fox News, and watching how the stuff that I was very familiar with from the '90s was creeping into mainstream discourse through these enablers in right-wing media, and Fox News particularly, Rush Limbaugh as well as figures like Michael Savage and others. So, this was what I was actually actively reporting on at that time. And so it became a little bit more theoretical then, partly because I wasn't on the ground as much. But beginning in 2017, that changed.
Yeah, and it seems like you had accumulated such careers worth, decades worth of material, that theorizing that probably at that point seemed like the next natural step in terms of investigating.
Yeah. Well, when I came to, for instance, the reporting about the Minutemen movement of the 2005 and onward, which is what And Hell Followed Wither was about. There was a lot of, I thought that the national media did a really poor job of contextualizing what this movement was and who these people were about and what they represented. And so I thought it was really important to explain to people, no, this is actually a movement that's fundamentally psychopathic. It's devoid of any empathy, and it attracts psychopaths. And, you know, which is eventually embodied by the psychopathic behavior of its members, such as Shauna Ford, who, you know, led a gang that murdered a 9-year-old girl in her home. And it was part of understanding that mentality entailed really sort of getting into her life story and figuring out how she became this psychopathic person and what path led her down this course of radicalization. And I thought it was very illuminating, very illuminating case.
I'm very happy that you took that logical leap into psychopathy and the kind of psychological factors that go into it, because it's something that I'm really interested in studying, specifically with the relationship with identity politics and identity thinking and how it can easily morph into some of these cultures that you study. Yeah. So I'd like to shelve that for just a few minutes and stay nevertheless with the Eliminationists that you published in 2009, which talks about the radicalization through hate speech or hate talk radio, basically.
Yeah. Well, through media, through right-wing media, because they were the ones who were promulgating all this hate speech, all this real hatred of liberals and liberalism and any component thereof, and really making half of the country out to be the enemy of America. And frankly, they've been successful. I mean, if you look at our political landscape today, I would say that half of the country, the Trumpist half, genuinely hates the other half. And I don't think that's true of people on the liberal side. I think we all want to have a civil democratic society, and we don't see them as the enemy. We just see them as our opposition, which is that's sort of a natural part of political discourse. These aren't people that we are going to go and scream at and raise black flags of no surrender at and threaten basically with civil war, which is what they've been doing. Yeah. And frankly, that all started with this division basically back in, it started in the 90s with Limbaugh and then morphed into, and then became really a national drumbeat with Fox News. So that by the 2000s, you basically had a cable station that 24/7 was coaching half of America to hate the other half. And, that's just a recipe for total, chaos. That's just a recipe for division, especially when that half that's being coached is being fed nothing but an endless stream of falsehoods, false factual information and hysterical screeching. The hysteria around immigration, for example, is just a classic example of how they would demonize other people, and it spread. Of course, it wasn't just the immigrants that they were demonizing. It was anyone who wanted open borders, as they call it. That's who they were demonizing the same people at the same time. And that's, a pretty large chunk of the country, because most of us understand the role of immigration. We understand that we need people to come and provide unskilled labor at this country, because this country does a really lousy job of producing unskilled labor because we have a terrific education system. Amazing. People just don't think this stuff through a lot of times, and they just swallow the sort of easy demonization, which is how this stuff grows and spreads.
And just to build off of that, my introduction to radio talk shows basically was Rush Limbaugh as an undergraduate. And it's amazing how easy one can be indoctrinated into that culture of information and knowledge, especially at a young age, in the mid 90s, when it was starting to emerge as an industry for politicizing certain sectors of the nation at a very large, at a national scale, basically. I think that Limbaugh was one of the leaders, I think, in slowly introducing misinformation, slowly introducing conspiracy theories. But still, and this leads to my next question, because you kind of talk about it in The Eliminationists, it's almost like conspiracy theories back then in the mid 90s, even though they were heading towards the conspiracism we see now, still were kind of anchored in the JFK notion of a conspiracy that still required a certain semblance of facts, certain semblance of, in other words, you couldn't counter someone's theory on a specific issue with a set of alternative facts that are equally valid somehow in terms of their facticity, but nonetheless undermine your set of established facts just because we have an alternative set of facts. That thinking wasn't seeping into conspiracism and conspiracy theory until, I think you make a great point, until Fox News started gaining more and more power, and they started almost noticing that people are willing to buy some of these conspiracies really easily, which is what then I think transitioned into a larger movement that you call eliminationism in your 2009 publication. So just to define for people what you mean by eliminationism, it's quote, a politics and a culture that shuns dialogue and the democratic exchange of ideas in favor of outright elimination of the opposing side through suppression, exile, ejection, or extermination. Now, I strongly agree that a lot of this was happening in the 90s, but one thing we haven't discussed is that a lot of this was kind of the tipping point was the election of an African-American president who led to the explosion of conspiracy theories, starting with the birther conspiracy that questioned a Black sitting, that almost tried to impeach a sitting president based on falsehoods surrounding his nationality, his religion, and essentially anything that questioned his Americanism. I think I'm missing one. His religious affiliation.
Right. His citizenship.
Race. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And that's it was, it was really troubling because initially it looked like the birther conspiracy wasn't going to go anywhere, and it was going to kind of finally fade after being roundly pushed for 2 years. And, it become something that generally by 2011, Republicans were shying away from it. And then Donald Trump came along and changed all that. And it was Donald Trump who changed the discourse on the birther conspiracy. And he made it legitimate, partly because the media did such a poor job of actually countering. I mean, the whole birther conspiracy was just ludicrous on the face of it. Obama originally presented the same document that anyone from Hawaii would present as proof of their birth. Twice. And then finally, when they produced the third, even that wasn't enough to satisfy these conspiracy theorists. They immediately set upon the thing and set about proving that it was fake. Incidentally, one of the real nexuses of this trend on the internet of these internet detectives being able to prove the falsity of stuff was actually back in 2004. When there was the whole discussion about 60 Minutes' expose of George W. Bush's time in the Air National Guard. And they had this letter from a colonel that they presented, but it turned out that the provenance of that letter was problematic. And immediately everybody got a copy of this letter, and these internet detectives set about proving somehow that the letter was fake. And it actually, the media widely swallowed this stuff, and it became a big fad. And this was actually one of the origin points where you have people doing their own research. And so, there's been this sort of slow development of all of these trends over the years. There have been flashpoints where things have happened, but absolutely, Obama's election was the one that, what I really think, happened was the Republicans decided even then and there that, well, if we can't win democratically, they're not going to try to change their tactics to win democratically. They're going to find ways to end, they're going to find ways to impose authoritarianism over democracy. And that's certainly what we've come down to now.
It's almost like they got away with it in 2000, and in 2008, it didn't work the way they expected it. So now if we can't win the way we won in 2000, then maybe we needed to start attacking the winner if it's not our person, and undermine the legitimacy of the entire election process in some ways, right? Because
well, and not just the entire election process, because of course that is the key component, but also the government in general. They've made governance impossible so that the government doesn't run right, and people aren't getting, like during the pandemic, we weren't getting the kind of support and management of that crisis that a competent government would have. And as a result, people become frustrated and angry with government. And it just feeds the radicalization loop when they do that.
And so this brings me to my final question about the eliminationists, because, in terms of establishing a kind of a Neiwert genealogy, it seems like this is a very important work that then later feeds into your most recent publication.
Yeah.
So you talk about the concept of transmitters, and it seems almost like in the eliminationists, you start to talk about what previously could have been considered these voices that exist in the media and on radio and in places like that,
Right.
were elevated to this sociological phenomena called transmitters, where they function almost as nodes that redistribute misinformation or false information or some of the skepticism that you're describing to a larger audience. So my question is, using, this is a Big Lebowski reference, using the parlance of our time, can we refer to transmitters as kind of super spreaders of extremist ideologies rather, that actually—
I would say that's exactly what they are.
And that they
spread.
It's
not, and it's not just the ideology, it's sort of the mode of being that we're talking about. The key to the whole, one of the key to the thesis of eliminationism is that one of the real hallmarks of right-wing extremist thought and this sort of anti-democratic strains of it is that it's embodied in the shape of this rhetoric, which is eliminationist, which is to say that rather than try to debate Americans, they're going to demonize the Americans that they oppose and basically create a milieu where we want to cast them out because they become objects fit only for elimination. They're vermin, they're diseases, they're whatever. And it's this mode of thought that is really a really key part of what they transmit. They transmit this idea that this way of being and way of thinking, and it is like a virus. It is very contagious. I would say, the underlying impulse in eliminationism is authoritarianism. And I've been exploring that a lot more in more recent years because, we're obviously undergoing a wave of authoritarianism, not just in the United States, but globally. And it's very worrisome.
And there's this new kind of transcontinental American-European alliance around authoritarianism, and even including Russia into the need to rescue the world from ourselves with strong leaders and strong nations making the right calls on our behalf, right?
Right. I mean, you can see it in Hungary, you can see it in Turkey, you can see it in Syria, and as well in the Philippines, and in Myanmar. And frankly, China is not a lot better. China is fundamentally authoritarian as well.
I would agree.
it's just a different kind of authoritarianism. It doesn't. It's not a right-wing populist authoritarianism like we're seeing in the Philippines and elsewhere. But it's still authoritarianism, and and honestly, I don't, as far as I can see, in terms of the sort of movements that are the far right movements that are being underwritten by these foreign powers. This includes particularly in Europe and elsewhere. We're primarily talking about Russia and that whole axis of Russia and Hungary and that whole axis of far right thought. There's Ukraine's a very worrisome spot right now too. So and Poland. It's all, there's just, we're just drowning in right-wing authoritarianism, and these are very much real movements, and it's part of what we're experiencing in the United States is very much a reflection of that, because the Russians have been attacking us with misinformation and disinformation. And I'm not one of these people that blames the Russians for this, because what they're actually doing is leveraging already existing fault lines. This is stuff, they're just making use of stuff that's already buried in our genes. And we're not being smart enough to recognize it.
Yeah, it's not like Putin came up with Facebook. He's just this isn't, the Russians are making it worse, there no doubt, but that's not the root of our problem. Yeah. And so in many ways, one of the things that you say in the elimination is like, we don't pay attention to the contagion, to the virus element of these ideologies and extremism until they manifest themselves as social pathologies, until the violence comes out,
right,
until there's a mass shooting, until there's a financial grift. And I'm thinking here of Stop the Steal campaign and taking money from people to pay for Trump's debts that have nothing to do with campaigns, investigations, and that kind of stuff. There's like variations on a theme here in terms of how people are harmed by these transmitters or super spreaders in a way that, and I said this, it reminds me a lot, and you say this in the last chapter in terms of the larger problem that it can happen here. And one of the quotes that really struck me from the final chapters of the Eliminationists is that one of the larger problems you hoped to confront in the book was, quote, the frightened refusal by most Americans, right and left, to come to grips with the meaning of fascism and how that blind spot renders us vulnerable to it. End of quote. So transitioning from Eliminationists to Alt-America, I read Alt-America, and I communicated this to you, it's kind of like the I told you this was going to happen book.
Yeah, well, my Cassandra complex has been going crazy. I just hope I do better than Cassandra did.
We cannot blame you. That's all I'm going to say. There's plenty of evidence even behind me.
I wasn't the only person talking about this, but I will say that and the thing about what of course was really disappointing about this to me was the way, of course, I expected the response from conservatives that I got, which was that, oh, you're just a partisan hack, blah, 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 blah. And of course, from the far right, the you commie stuff. But yeah, I'm getting put on Nazi death lists and stuff like that, which has happened. But I was I've been disappointed in sort of the mainstream centrist and liberal democratic response, as well as even the progressive response. Even progressive Democrats, we've all gotten so siloed into our single issues that we're not stopping to take a look at the big picture. And a lot of the big picture is that we're up against some really powerful forces, some really powerful trends. And these trends can't, we need to understand them. We need to take them seriously. We can't just say, oh, there's hardly any white nationalists. We don't have to worry about that, except that they're now, in number in the millions online. Let's get real about this, can we? I mean, and I'm not, look, I'm a guy from Idaho, was raised Republican, I left the party in the 80s, but became an independent. And
John Birch community, from what I've read, right?
Yeah, I grew up in a John Birch community, but I kind of that was actually my immunization to to early immunization to conspiracism. I think was a product of growing up in a John Birch community. But yeah, I understand working class and rural people, and I know how they think, and also know how susceptible they can be to, especially appeals to patriotism and all the stuff that the right-wing extremists do, and also the appeals to, one of the real appeals of conspiracism is the sort of empowerment that it gives you. It makes you feel you have access to secret knowledge nobody else has, and you have an advantage. And that's a very powerful thing, and that's a lot of what's it's part of the appeal of authoritarianism as well. So I would say the main thing is that it's frustrating because I feel like I'm just reporting. I mean, honestly, in a lot of ways, I still just adhere to my basic ethos that I have had going back to the late 70s and early 80s as a beat reporter. Just try to report as accurately and wholly on a subject as you can. And, and I've long been accustomed to having partisan impulses for reporting straight up facts. It's just comes with the territory, and I usually just brush it off. But I think, I think a lot of progressives and centrist liberals are really invested in having things continue to be normal.
Yeah.
And they want to believe that we're just going to be able to continue on with politics we had in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And I think Trump has permanently transformed our politics, and I don't think we're going back to normal for a very long time.
I so much completely agree with a lot of what you said. And one of the things that really frustrates me is that once Biden was elected president, it's almost like all the tensions that people were struggling with up to 2020, there's like this anesthetized feeling over the entire country in terms of like not calling out the current administration and with the same passions that we were calling out the previous administration about a lot of the same issues that we found fault with the previous administration. The only difference being that previous administration was overtly racist, and this one doesn't seem to be, even though we still have problems with the borders, even though we still have problems with a lot of these, that there's at least an effort. And I think that it does a lot. What it does is it prepares the next election cycle for an even more extremist to come to the picture and say that I can fix a dysfunction that Democrats seem in love with. I can fix this and make it more orderly. And that's one of the things I think that Trump did really well.
Yeah. No, I think it's true. I mean, we're just, I think we're in for trouble.
and that kind of connects the Alt-America with the eliminationists. Is the spilling over already happened, and this is what happens when that spilling over takes effect. It starts to become kind of like its own political industry. Two things that really struck me is the fact that you hold the failure of conservatives, you hold them accountable for their failure to stop the fringe from spilling over into the mainstream, which you acknowledge in all America as being one of their traditional roles. There used to be kind of like the, shall we say, the levee that protected America.
Well, they were very buttoned down. I mean, that was conservative meant being a businessman, basically, and businessmen are very much invested in maintaining the status quo. And these extremists just want to blow the whole fucking thing up.
And it seems like they did a great job of doing that, right? From Ted Cruz, vote your conscience at right before the primaries, to like basically saying, well, I guess you did, and he won, and now I'm gonna, basically do whatever again to get in good with the guy who's in charge.
Or Lindsey Graham.
Or Lindsey Graham. There's so many of them that lined up, and now he's completely transformed the party to the point where they cannot go back. They're trying to, but when Liz Cheney becomes the martyr for conservatism and Mitt Romney, we're in trouble. Yeah, the Overton window has switched to that degree. It's like we're in a completely different political environment at this point.
And Democrats are just so invested in believing, and especially people like Manchin, but even the Chuck Schumers and for that matter, to some extent, Joe Biden, are really invested in sort of promulgating the idea that, we can still have, democratic politics as they were practiced. And we just can't. Yeah, I mean, one of the most obvious things is that the filibuster has to go. The filibuster is a profoundly anti-democratic add-on to what was already the most anti-democratic body we have in the government, and that's the Senate. And basically, it was so rarely used up until the 1990s. It was a tool that only came out on rare occasions. And beginning in the 1990s, Republicans began abusing it so much to try to prevent Bill Clinton from getting his agenda passed that it became just a standard thing. So that by 2000 or so, it was a standard view in Washington that every vote in the Senate had to have 60 votes. It's like, what the fuck? Where did that come from? I grew up, one of my mentors, was Frank Church, the senator from Idaho in the 1970s, who headed up the Church Committee that investigated the CIA. And Frank warned me about all this shit way back. We used to go out fishing, and he would have these long talks on the fishing boat. He said, what I really worry about is the Latin Americanization of America. Not that we would become
Latin Americans.
Not that we become full of Latino people, but rather that our form of government would come to represent or be like what we see in Latin America, with basically oligarchic dictatorships run by right-wing populists. And this is, he had a lot of good advice and saw a lot of this coming.
So you were red-pilled into critical thinking and asking questions at an early age.
Yes, it was.
So this is the blind spots that you were talking about in 2009 that come back to haunt us by 2016 and 2017. You're writing this book saying, like, now they're here, now we're paying the price for that. So just to confirm, and I wrote this question down, it seems like many people still refuse to acknowledge the emergence of authoritarianism. It seems like we agree on that. And it seems like you still find this to be the case, even in light of Trump's rhetoric and his extreme efforts to hold on to power, like motivating an entire crowd to storm the Capitol on January 6th.
Yeah, no,
people still won't call it a fascism.
We're still in denial about what January 6th meant. Okay. We're still allowing congressmen and media figures to credibly say, it wasn't an insurrection. It wasn't a violent insurrection. And all you have to do is read one of the many, many, many court documents that have been filed in these cases to be, have that illusion shattered, because all you need to do is read some of these affidavits about what took place that day. Or just go look at that video that the New York Times put together that recounted everything that happened that day. And anybody who could say that was not a violent armed insurrection is simply drinking the Kool-Aid, man. That's you're on laughing gas or something, because you're not seeing what the rest of us actually see.
Yeah, that level of
trying
denial.
to tell us that it wasn't, then you're gaslighting us.
Yeah, that's the alternative facts world that comes with an alternative reality where you can completely read it any way you want, where to the rest of us, it's obvious what is happening. And it's ironic that people that are reported on the need on social media to fight back against this seeming fascist takeover of the US government through the taking of Congress are getting more time in prison than the actual people that were there storming the Capitol.
So far,
right. So far,
I actually think the DOJ is doing a pretty credible job of handling this so far from the court documents I'm reading. I think that they're taking this very seriously. And I know the investigation's not over.
Okay.
This is the most complex prosecution in history. And
you're the first person I've heard say that, David, as a journalist. They're not reporting this as ongoing and it's getting deeper and deeper. They're just reporting like, this woman got to take 2 weeks off to go to a wedding, even though you're getting those stories, but not what you just said. So please, sorry to interrupt. Can you please repeat that?
No, it's all right. Yeah, no, I mean, it's one of the frustrating things of reporting on this is that, we're actually, the trial of the Oath Keepers was just delayed this week by the judge because he said, he's saying we're still got evidence coming in, and it's still, and the DOJ has been very clear that there is still a mountain of evidence out there that they are sifting through. And not only that, they're getting cooperating witnesses who are providing new avenues of investigation, particularly in this conspiracy case. I'm pretty sure that eventually we're going to see seditionist conspiracy charges raised against some of the key leaders, the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys, and perhaps some of the political figures who were conspiring with them behind the scenes.
Okay, I think that.
But I think that the evidence is still being compiled in that area.
So they want to build a tight case, basically heading
up
to bigger figures.
You don't want to, if you're going to go after these figures, you've got to have all your ducks in a row. Yeah, totally, because they're masters of propaganda, and they're masters of changing the court of public opinion.
I mean, these were patriots taking a tour of the Capitol.
They're just tourists.
Tourists. Had it been a Black Lives
tourists with mace,
and radios and bulletproof vests and flagpoles that they're taking. That it's ridiculous, but usually
tasers. And actually, a lot of them did have guns.
Yeah, and
a lot of them did have guns, but they just didn't get them out.
But it's like we never find out who burned down the Reichstag, so it's like that kind of thing. It's like, oh, but that happened, ironically, So, so I think this segues nicely into your latest book, Red Pill, Blue Pill, which I think is a very important book. As I mentioned earlier, I think I look at this as your theory book. Like, all right, David finally wrote a theory book where we can actually dive into the why this is happening, even though you've done that in your other works, but more in depth, I think, in this book. So I think it's a very important, very instructive book to people who are interested in how radicalization functions in contemporary day America, and more importantly, something that you can begin to do against fighting such radicalization at the individual level. So one of the urgencies that you call attention to is to convince people of the ubiquitous nature of radicalization and extremism in this country. And I related this to you over email correspondence a little bit. It reminds me a lot of Robert Hare, the psychologist who wrote Without Conscience, who talks about psychopaths, and the urgency of that book in terms of like people from social workers to police officers to first responders don't recognize the widespread presence of the psychopaths among us, and they need to start being able to identify them early on, because too many of them slip through the cracks and we don't realize that they are who they are until they've done too much damage, until something criminal happens and they're investigated, and then they have to take all these tests and we find out this person has no remorse, and you go through the checklist. It seems to me that you started trying to raise these red flags in the eliminationists, but in many ways, it seems that you discussing how this happens in terms of red pilling effect echoes a lot of what Robert Hare is doing in something like Without Conscience,
Right.
and that you're offering not only the psychological reasons why people get red pilled or why some people are already vulnerable to getting red pilled before it happens, but you offer examples like, I think Dylan Roof is a casebook study of how someone gets red pilled, not into an ideology, because you can argue that, you know, Dylan was already flirting with some of that ideology, but as a young person, just like me listening to Rush Limbaugh, I could have gone to a different path. Or you can not become an extremist if, you know, you just come across some kind of sense of normalcy, which unfortunately Dylan didn't, because he started to investigate black on white crime and everything just went south from there. So I was particularly struck by this following sentence, if I may, quote, "The problem is that they," and by they, I mean, you mean people who have been red pilled, "their version of reality isn't based in facts, sound evidence, or even logical reasoning, but rather is a complex farrago of conjecture, false facts, and evidence, wild-eyed paranoia, and sociopathic authoritarianism," end quote. I'm especially interested in that last concept of people being red pilled into sociopathic authoritarianism, as it's something that I'm obviously researching. So my first question is basically red pilling a version of the contagion or transmitters you talk about in the Eliminationists.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely it is. No, it's the same virus. And yeah, we do, part of it, you know, as I mentioned, we've been eagerly in denial of how its effects and its presence and its toxic presence in our society, to the point that I think even law enforcement doesn't recognize it. I use, you know, I mean, it is very theoretical, but I provide a lot of real world examples of what's going on. And what I spent a fair amount of time on the Las Vegas massacre of 2017, which was really just a prime example of everybody, the whole country believes that, oh, it was just a one-off that we can't explain, because law enforcement examined the case and couldn't come up with an explanation. And the reason law enforcement couldn't come up with an explanation was that what appears to have primarily motivated Stephen Paddock, the gunman in that case, was his belief in conspiracy theories, and his belief that the US government was trying to take away our guns, and that he needed to do something to wake America up, which is actually a very common motive for terrorist actions and is becoming more common. We just had a guy arrested in Virginia, or actually he's from Texas, but he was planning to bomb an Amazon data center. He bought what he thought was C4 from an FBI informant as a part of his plan to bomb this Amazon data center, because he wanted to create a government overreaction to his response that would wake America up. And this is what Paddock was doing. But and there's plenty of evidence that this was the case. Virtually everybody who knew him described him as an avid conspiracy theorist. And there are several witness accounts about people who talked to him in the days before the massacre. And, you know, and of course, this was part of my motivation for writing that book, was that my niece was in that crowd. That's the young woman that I describe in the one chapter, and how she survived. That's the account of my niece.
You say that in the book, David?
Huh? I didn't say that in the book. I was kind of kept her. Wow. For the book, I kept her identity, you know, removed. But yeah, that's my.
It was very personal to you at that moment.
And it just drove home to me how this stuff affects everyone. And part of the point of all that was that, I mean, yeah, 58 people died that night, and another 800 were wounded. But there were literally thousands of people. There were over 6,000 people in that crowd, and every single one of them was permanently traumatized for the rest of their freaking lives by that event. And that's what happens with conspiracism and conspiracy theories. When this stuff comes, when people act out on this stuff, it just has just powerfully devastating effects. So yeah, it's really troubling that we are so institutionally incapable of recognizing what's happening to us.
And that concludes part 1 of our conversation with David Neiwert. Please make sure to join us for part 2, and if you enjoyed today's episode, you can subscribe and receive notifications when new episodes are released. Until next time, thanks for listening.